Good morning and welcome to the Atlanta Council. I'm Steve Grundman, the M.A. and George Lund Fellow here at the Council. The purpose of this morning's event is to hear Dr. Bill LaPlante, the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Acquisition. He will talk about industry and government roles in Air Force acquisition. Welcome to the Atlanta Council, Bill, and thank you very much for taking the time to make this address and have a conversation with us. I also want to welcome General Arnold Panaro, the Chairman of the National Defense Industrial Association. Thank him, thank you Arnold, for NDIA's co-sponsorship of this Defense Industrial Policy Series. Momentarily I will prevail upon Arnold to introduce our featured speaker. Dr. LaPlante's address this morning will be the fourth event in this series. The series aims to create the preeminent platform from which public officials address the government's stewardship of defense industrial resources. It is the public sector complement, if you will, to our Captains of Industry series, at which we hear business executives' perspectives on the public interests their companies serve and the public policies that shape their markets. Among previous speakers in the Captains of Industry series is Ellen Lord, who's here from Textron Systems. Thanks for coming, Ellen. The most recent previous event in this series, the Defense Industrial Policy Series, was an address by Senator Mark Warner, who spoke here at the beginning of April. The impetus for this series, like the Captains of Industry series, is twofold. First, we recognize that government's partnership with industry is a vital thread in the overall fabric of U.S. national security and of the national security of its allies and partners around the globe. Indeed, it should be noted that this very proposition was central to the establishment here at the Council of the M.A. and George Lund Fellowship, which I hold, courtesy of the generosity of George Lund, who could not be here today, but who is one of the vice chairmen of the Scowcroft Center. Second, among the impeti here, is the recognition that the government-industry relationship is itself at an inflection formed by the confluence of several factors. First among these factors is a more austere fiscal environment. But in addition, there is the fact that allied militaries now are receding from more than a decade of counterinsurgency wars, that astonishing advances in technology are changing military operations and tactics, and we need only look at this week's front page, that threats and antagonists continue to reposition themselves. All these factors have inflected how business and government work together to enhance national security. The Defense Industrial Policy Series is an initiative in collaboration with NDIA of the Council's Scowcroft Center on International Security, and it's a further expression of what its namesake, General Brent Scowcroft, had in mind for the center: the cultivation of a transatlantic constituency for strategic thinking and practical solutions for the problems of international security around the globe. I can hardly think of a more suitable suite of government executives to serve up some strategic thinking and practical solutions for government stewardship of defense industrial resources than the service acquisition executives of the three military departments, of which Bill is the Air Force SAE. And you can rest assured, I've asked Bill to set a good example for his counterparts in the Army, Heidi Shue, and in the Navy, Sean Stackley. You can rest assured we will try to get Heidi Shue and Sean Stackley here on this stage in this series later in the year. The agenda for our proceedings is very straightforward. Dr. LaPlante will speak for about a half hour, following which he and I will sit down over there. I will exercise the prerogative of moderator to ask, get a few questions of my own in, and then I will open the floor for questions from those of you here in the audience. I will remind all that this is a fully open and on-the-record event, so if when I call you, you would please identify yourself by name and affiliation, I would appreciate that. I also should point out that we are live streaming this event and tweeting the juiciest parts of it at the hashtag, and there will be juicy parts, I'm assured, at the hashtag AC Scowcroft, ACSCOWCROFT. And if those of you watching online would like to pose a question, you may direct it through that hashtag, and one of our staff, if it's a really good question, will bring me a note and I will consider it. Okay, now I'd like to welcome Arnold Panaro, a director of the Atlanta Council, to the stage to introduce Bill LaPlante. You see, I was literally about to say Arnold would not indulge nor require an elaborate introduction. He's ready to go. It suffices to say Arnold Panaro, the chairman of the National Defense Industrial Association. Thanks, Arnold.
Right, appreciate it. Thank you. Well, on behalf of NDIA and our leadership, my colleagues at Ashworth, our vice chairman, our CEO, General Larry Farrell, Ellen Lord's on our board. I see many of our colleagues here. We're very excited about this partnership. We're off to a great start. This is a critical time to talk about this topic. we've all been around a long time. We've watched the acquisition system wax and wane. We've watched the top line of the budgets wax and wane. We've gone through turbulent times in terms of foreign challenges. And right now, we probably have one of the most unique opportunities to make some significant reforms, changes, and differences to basically get better outcome for the dollars that we put in to the Defense Department than we've seen in a long time. And the reason is because of the strong leadership that we have in the department, not just Bill, but Frank Kendall at the top. He's one serious dude. He's going to be there through the duration. We don't have the turnover like we used to have in that top job every 2 years. His top team partnered with folks like Bill LaPlante and Heidi Shue and Sean Stackley, and with Mac Thornberry, partnered with Adam Smith on the House, Levin and Inhofe on the Senate, are all committed to making significant changes. And we in industry are very pleased to be able to feed into that input. I see our colleagues from some of the other associations here. We're all working together. We've got John Etherton leading our effort to feed into what the department is doing and what the Congress is doing. And so all of us should put our thinking caps on. And a lot of us are skeptical because we've heard this before. And as I've said in public before, if I didn't think we had a real opportunity to make some serious changes, we wouldn't be spending the time and energy and investment our company's members are spending. Sid and I are spending a lot of time on this, our member companies, because we really do think with the leadership of people like Bill LaPlante and Frank Kendall, Mac Thornberry, and others, we can make the changes that need to be made. Obviously, he's the head of the whole Air Force acquisition system, from research and development to personnel management to procurement, operation oversight of the whole acquisition system as set up by the Packard Commission recommendations in '86. He's got decades of experience working in this area. He's held senior positions at MITRE and other places, advanced degrees in all the right technical areas. When Dave Packard made the recommendations of the Packard Commission, I was the staff director of the Armed Services Committee and had to write up the legislation with my colleagues to implement it. And I remember when Senator Nunn and I met with Dave Packard and his team, and Packard said to Senator Nunn, he said, "Senator Nunn, the most important thing that we are doing in our recommendation is the people." He said, all these changes we're making on the procedural side will not work if you do not get people that have experience running large, complex technical programs as these senior acquisition executives. That was Dave Packard. He would love it, Bill, to know that you are now in government and leading the large 30+ billion Air Force effort. Bill's made the transition into government very rapidly. He brings common sense, something that is not found in abundance in government in some places. He brings decisive leadership to an acquisition portfolio that sometimes is criticized as being too bureaucratic. I'd say Bill LaPlante is a doer. He's not a ditherer. And for us in industry, we need to understand that. He's not going to muck around and mess around. He's going to make decisions and move out. The other thing is, he's a true believer in the two-way street with industry. And General Welch spoke to one of our breakfasts the other day, and he says, look, we've got to get this fixed. We've got to have the dialogue. We've got to work together. The outcomes that our troops need on the battlefield, the reason we have the finest military in the world is quality people, realistic and constant training, and cutting-edge technology. If you don't have the cutting-edge technology, you can train all you want, but you're not going to be decisive on the battlefield. We've got to work as a team. And Bill LaPlante believes in that. He's a terrific leader. Dr. LaPlante, we're thrilled to have you here this morning. Welcome, and thank everybody for coming out on a beautiful summer day.
Thanks, Alan. Thank you. That's a very kind introduction. I was even impressed with what I heard about me. I want to start by just, for the record, so I don't get myself in trouble, I have two bosses, well, three, including my wife, Frank Kendall and Secretary James. Frank is giving a press conference at 11:30 with Sean Stackley, and I guarantee you his is more important than mine, and I better not make more news than he does. So I'm just teasing. I'm teasing him. We both realized that last night. Actually, what Frank is doing at 11:30, I'm going to weave it into my remarks, is he's releasing the second report on the performance of the acquisition system. And I'll even give you some of the kind of the takeaways that I have from that report. And that's the first thing. And the second, the reason that Sean Stackley is there is that we're releasing a pilot that the Navy did and the other services, including, of course, Army and Air Force are going to do on what's called a Superior Supplier Initiative. Some of you may have heard of that. So both of those are going to be talked about at the Pentagon at 11:30. So let me start by saying what I hope to accomplish here, and then, of course, I'm looking forward to the question and answer. First is to go through fairly quickly, if I can, in about 10 or 15 minutes, the priorities that we've established in Air Force acquisition, and then go into some remarks about industry. I'll try not to resort to cliches and things that we all know and hear all the time, but sometimes the things that we know and cliches happen to be true, so in those cases I will point that out too. So, let me start by going through the priorities. To begin with, I've been in the job. I was confirmed, I think, in February or so, but I'd been the acting prior to that, essentially since Secretary Donnelly left. So we had some time to kind of look at and think about what were the points to focus on. Some of these may sound obvious, which doesn't mean that they're wrong. They're just obvious, and they're reinforcing things we are doing already. Some of them are things that we don't do and we need to think about. And it's stunningly obvious when you're outside the system, but when you get into the system and you're going to 13 meetings a day, it's easy to forget. So there are different categories. Let me go through there's 5 of them, not in necessarily any order, but obviously I talk about them in the same order, so I suppose psychologists would say I do prioritize them, but I don't mean to. The first is we've got to get the big programs right. The big programs, not just in dollars, but in priorities. The 3 that the Air Force has in terms of its priorities that are acquisition, and I'm just repeating what has been said by the leadership for some time now, are the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, the LRSB, the Long Range Strike Bomber, and the KC-46A, the tanker. All 3 of them are critical to the future of the Air Force, literally for decades to come, probably 4 or 5 decades in some cases. They're critical also in where we are in the acquisition of them. They're all in 3 different stages. So I'll very briefly go through the stages of each one of them and then mention a few other programs. I'll start with F-35. F-35 is everything you kind of read in the press, and most of the mainstream press kind of nails it, and what Frank Kendall says nails it. We're reasonably optimistic about the Marines IOC next year with the 2B software. 2B software that's the mission software for the Marines, is essentially done now. Lockheed may release one more drop. Most of the test points are done. So we're reasonably optimistic that the Marines IOC is on track, but we'll let the Marines say that, but I would say that's where they are. The Air Force is next, as you know. We are shooting for an IOC about 2 years from now, a little more than 2 years from now, summer of 2016, fall of 2016. That is the 3I software, is what the Air Force is going to IOC with. We are also reasonably confident that that's on schedule. It's a little bit more tight than 2B. And part of it is just because it's farther away, so there's more uncertainty. But I'd still say that IOC is still likely to be on time. Then the final, at least in this development program, software, which is what everybody really wants, IOC, no IOC. What we all want is this capability. It's in what's called 3F. This is when you bring in the sensor fusion from all different sources into the full capability. That is about 0 to 5 months behind, and it's still about 3.5 years away. So as General Bogdan says, and he's been saying it for the last year, and it hasn't changed, that's if we do no mitigation. So I think that by and large that paints the picture of where we are in the F-35. What do we need to worry about, right? There's things to worry about. I try to tell people, it's not that there isn't things to worry about, at least make sure you're worrying about something that is true today. Don't worry about the helmet. That was something to worry about last year, and it's largely been retired. Don't worry about the arresting hook. That's being worked. Worry about Alice, the logistics systems, the IT logistics system. Worry about getting the reliability and maintainability of that airplane, even as we fly it now, improved rapidly. Essentially, we need to get the availability of the aircraft higher than where it is now. And that's kind of an outcome metric, availability. It's fed by a lot of things, including reliability. That is something we have to be focused on like a laser beam. Of course, that is the underpinnings of what we often know is the long-term issue with F-35, which is the sustainment costs. And how are we going to sustain these airplanes globally? But if we have to get the reliability fixed now and addressed now to start to address that longer term. So those are the things that we're focused on. There was also, we had a brief press announcement yesterday that both the industry partners, this is an example of what Arnold was just talking about partnership, literally at the CEO level of Lockheed, Northrop Grumman, I want to make sure I get them all, BAE, Pratt & Whitney, working with Mr. Stackley, myself, and General Bogdan, and ultimately Mr. Kendall, are putting together an initiative to drive the cost. It's called the Blueprint for Affordability. It's to drive the cost per plane down further below the plan that it is today. And it's going to involves industry doing investment on its own, and then being able to get benefit from the investment, and then the taxpayer and the warfighter getting the cheaper airplane. So anyway, that's going on too. So there's a lot going on in F-35, a lot of goodness in F-35, things still to worry about, a lot of work still in front of us. KC-46A, the tanker is it's a fixed price development, as you all know, based upon the 767 Boeing plane. The so-called green airplane, which is kind of the non-fully outfitted version of the tanker, is right now in Everett on the line. They're getting to power on for that airplane. First flight of that airplane is sometime this summer. And then we're hoping that we're planning for, not hoping, the schedule has first flight of the first KC-46 that's being outfitted at the end of the year, beginning of next year. Still, there's still things to watch in that program. I think one of the challenges in that program is actually the integrated test schedule, because we're doing some. It's a hybrid between how the DoD does testing and how commercial does testing, where we're bringing in FAA, we have the DT and the OT all together doing combined testing. The idea is to get through the testing so everybody gets their data and gets what they need in a way that's efficient. And that is actually something that is close to a commercial model. It's not completely a commercial model that we're going to do there. That's probably, I would say, the big challenge in front of us is how will that actually work. Then the third program, which there's always limited amount we can say about it, is the long-range strike, the next bomber. The bomber, most of it is classified. What we've publicly said, and the requirements to that have been fixed since about 2010, is it's part of a family of systems. So you don't just think about the bomber itself. It's also the accompanying ISR, electronic attack, communications, weapons, delivery weapons. That program is in a competitive phase. We're probably days away from releasing the final RFP for that program. Of course, I'm learning in the Pentagon days away can go on for a long time, but hopefully this really is days away. So the schedule then is probably start getting the proposals in near the end of the summer, early fall, and then source selection finalized early next year. That program, of course, is designed around a pretty fixed set of requirements, the idea being relatively mature technologies, build the first version, knowing that it's not going to have everything on it that we want or will want. We're building it in an adaptable approach where it's an open architecture, has places on the wings, hardening on the wings, other things that allow us to customize sensors and weapons and future capabilities. In other words, anticipate what we did, for example, with F-16, where when you look at inside an F-16 today, it's nothing like the F-16 when it first came out. Let's build a truly block approach, make it adaptable. Let's not fall into the trap that we fall into too often, which is try to put so much into the first version that after a while the system realizes there may not be a second, so they try to get more stuff into the first version, then it gets pushed to the right, and then we all know what happens. We're trying to stick to the discipline of producing the 80%, and that's where that bomber is. Those are the big three. A couple other programs that are being started in this austere environment. We're not starting many programs, but the ones we're getting started are the ones we have to focus really hard on because if you don't start them right, there's not a whole lot you can do later. So what are the programs we got to start and get going right? Well, we're about ready to issue the award for the combat rescue helicopter. So that's literally going to happen in the next week or two. Another program that we're looking at, or we have a lot of work to do to get ready for, is the replacement for Air Force One. Presidential Aircraft Replacement, PAR is what it's sometimes called. We have a good deal of work going on there. We have work to be done on the recapitalization of JSTARS. So those are examples of programs where, and for us in the acquisition world, and that upfront piece is where we have to really work hard. We have to work hard with our colleagues in the requirements community, make sure that the budgeteers have it fully funded, do the affordability analysis, all the rest. That happens right at the very beginning. There's a lot of times where you wish you had a time machine, you're sitting in a meeting and you say, gee, how did this happen? And then you hear the story and it's like, okay. And so then I always use the line when I'm sitting in a meeting, I say, okay, let's pretend we're in this room 10 years from now. What would we want our future selves to know? Well, okay, we're gonna do it right. We're gonna do this, and this. So you always have to get the first part of the program set up correctly. So those are the first priority is the eye on the ball of those acquisition programs. Of course, the nature of the business is we're judged often by our weakest program, so we could have an ACAT 3 somewhere that blows up on us, so you have to worry about that too. But I really want to make sure that we literally on a daily basis at the program manager and PEO level, on the weekly basis, we track the progress of each one of those programs I mentioned. And getting to industry, we work, we can always do better, have open comms with the industry partners on those programs. You know, the meeting I was just at yesterday with F-35 with Mr. Kendall and Sean Stackley it was called the CEO Roundtable. Secretary James was there. It was down at Eglin Air Force Base. But it was with, Marilyn Houston from Lockheed, Wes Bush from Northrop, Ian King from BAE, just right there with us. So I just was on the phone this morning with one of them on a different program. We are always talking to each other, and we need to do that because there's always notes to compare. What I hear in my job and what Frank hears in his job may not be what the CEO hears in their job, and sometimes it's interesting when you have one level of management below you in the room, because sometimes when having the bosses there is always helpful. So we're working. That's all part of getting those programs right. Is that communication. The second priority is kind of what I was just talking about, but really, and what I hear about is transparency. We do a very good job, in my opinion, inside Air Force acquisition, talking to each other, a reasonable job talking across the Air Force. We can be a little better on requirements. We do not do a good job generally talking outside the Air Force, and even outside the department. I think part of it is just the nature of acquisition. It's hard to talk about. It's not, to talk about it correctly is not exciting all the time. And so that's hard. I also think that there's, I call it, I don't know, zombie truths, things that were true at one time, but you can't kill, they're not anymore, but you can't kill them. There's the zombie truths in Air Force acquisition, and that I came in just like everybody else knowing them. Well, what am I talking about? Oh, this is going to be exaggerated for caricature, but you'll get my point. That you can be flying a jet one day and then your next assignment is you're a program manager for an ACAT 1 program. Not true. I don't know if it was ever true. If it was true, it probably was 20, 25 years ago, perhaps. The people that run these acquisition programs, particularly these PEOs, are pros. I mean, these guys and women are really, really good. I mean, I'd put the PEOs in the Air Force, and I'm sure it's true in the other services. They're really, really good. Many of them 30 years of experience in the acquisition system. The ones that are active duty are often test pilots, and if you know anything about the test pilot school and what you got to go through there, including your technical background, just really, really good PEOs. So that's not true. That's not true that can the acquisition workforce be better? Absolutely. Are we putting people in jobs that shouldn't be in these senior jobs? Not really. No. I mean, there's always the tail of the distribution in all of our organizations, but not really. Another zombie truth is we have all these protests that are successful. Last year, I think the number was see if I can get this right. 113,000 competitive awards. There were a little over 100 protests. 2 of them were successful. 2 of them were successful last year. None McCurdy's. happening all the time. We had 0 last year. We may have 1 this year, but it'll be, and maybe so far, but that'll be due not to anything in acquisition. It'll be due to a reduced quantity from the sequester. So most of the stuff that is going on in Air Force acquisition is quite good. But we don't do a good job talking about it. We also have to be good at talking about the things that aren't going well. What I told you about F-35 is just true. What is not going well is reliability on that plane. We got to get that fixed. It's just true. We need to do better. I'll give another example of things we're not doing well that we need to get better. We take too long on development programs. Most development programs are scheduled for 5 years, and they end up taking 7. As we all know, that's 2 years of paying a lot of money that we weren't planning to pay. So that's not good. So transparency is just talking. It's also collaborating with industry. We have, the Chief of the Air Force, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Welsh, and the Secretary have initiated a collaboration with industry. We're calling it Bending the Cost Curve, and we're just a few months into it. And in fact, NDIA is helping us with this. What we're doing, the idea is kind of simple. We want to pick a few, hopefully low-hanging fruit ideas that everybody knows needs to get done, and just get them done together with industry. Of course, me being from my background, I figure, well, you just form the teams, get off and get on with it, and then the lawyers find out about it. My wife's a lawyer, so I'm not against lawyers, but I said, what, you're forming a team with industry? How are you going to pick who's on the team? Oh, no. That's why, thank God for NDIA, right? But we're doing that. The first task we wanted to take on tasks that have measurable outcomes. Okay, first of all, what's the outcome we want to do, and is it something important to us? By the way, which is not easy, because you talk to people, what's an outcome you want to change in acquisition? Make it better. Well, I don't know what that means. So we're focusing on what are a couple of outcomes we think we can measure. And I gave an example one just a moment ago. Can we start finishing our development programs on time? You know, can we stop having development programs go too long? That's a simple metric that we can start measuring ourselves against. Anyway, one of the first tasks that we're taking on is, we call it the acquisition kill chain, which I suppose could have a bad connotation. But in the military, we all talk about kill chain. You got to, detect, control, engage, whatever you want to call it, MAPE. Pick your favorite. There's like 100 different ways to describe it. Well, there's an acquisition kill chain. It usually starts with, concept, requirement. You've all seen it. Systems engineering V is the same thing. But, the beginnings to concept development, understand the requirements, prototype, blah, 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 all the way through the EDM and then production. Well, there's a set of things that happen, particularly in that early part in acquisition, that all of us are frustrated with. Not just the quality of the work that goes on there, we're working on that, but also just the processes. How long it takes for us to get an RFP out. The communications in our RFI, the quality of our proposals. If we were having problems with quality of proposals with 1 or 2 contractors, then you could say it's probably the 1 or 2 contractors. But when it's happening all the time, maybe what's common to that? Maybe it's a bigger problem. So we're looking at that timeline, and each part, and it's not that the timeline itself we're trying to shorten, which we are, but we're looking at the key steps that happen at each part and what's causing frustration in each part for both industry and government, and we're doing a zero-based review on that. And included in that, we want to get to, is that upfront piece, which is what some have called development planning. That's the beginning part of, when we're not sure we need a program, we're not sure of the concept, but we need to actually put some heads together and start thinking about it. That is something that is still not resourced the way it needs to be in the Air Force. And I've said to others and I think others have said this, that people think doing an AOA is the same thing as doing upfront development planning. It is not. So how do we do that? How do we bring industry in at that part? The industry should be in there at the very beginning, throwing their concepts around, helping us with concepts and models, and particularly at the campaign or systems level. How do we do that yet not preclude that same industry team or individual industry partner from competing in the later part of the program? We have to work on that. The path of least resistance is to keep them out of that part, and that's wrong. So we're looking at all those pieces and bending the cost curve. The Secretary wants us also to add, a special group, Joint Industry Air Force group on business systems. So we're going to get that underway. And we're probably going to do one in the area of services contracting. Other ones we're talking about but no commitment to is better help on foreign military sales. It's a very bureaucratic process, as many of you know. You know, what can we do better? Can we help with strategies together? You know, because FMS done right, of course, helps all of us. In the F-35 program, FMS is really one of the hedges we have against in keeping the costs down. So how can we do more? There's a lot of great work going on in FMS, but how can we do more? Anyway, that's all part of our transparency initiative, and we always can do better, but that's part of it. I also think that Frank Kendall, by doing things, this fits into what Frank's doing, which is releasing data like he's doing today on this performance of the acquisition system. You know, I always say to people, being an engineer and a scientist, in most of the stuff I've worked in, you can't really get away with assertion, unless you've really earned it and you're just, you know, you just can't say, well, you know, the missile failed because the second stage rocket motor had this anomaly in it. Really, why do you say that? I don't know, it just seems like it. Really, is that just assertion, just kind of gut feel, you know? I mean, there's a few people that you might listen to if they say that, but probably there's one or two on the planet. Yet we do that in acquisition all the time. Why'd that program fail? Oh, you know what, they had the requirements creep. Really? How do you know that? Well, I just know, you know. Well, why, you know, or fixed price contracting, you know, fixed price contracting is the worst thing in the world, the best thing in the world. You know, misused, not misused. What Frank is doing is putting data against all that stuff. I know it's going to be less interesting because you still can't have the debates. It's unfortunate that we now have data, for example, that I'll give you some things that the data shows. I'm fascinated by this, and I don't know why, it's just data. Data that Frank's guys have in their report is that on development programs, if you take cost and schedule performance, and then you take the margin that presumably the industry partner actually achieved, there is no correlation, statistical, that's a statistical term, correlation, between the margin that the industry received and the performance of cost and schedule of that development program. In other words, you get the same, you get not a statistically significant margin, whether it's on time, 5 years, or something, an 8-year program. Wow, why is that? You know, and there's lots of theories, but just think about that. So we're starting to put data out like that. The other thing Frank's data is going to show today is, for whatever reason, and there's lots of theories, I have my own, but award fee doesn't generally give us good performance. Incentives work. The data shows that incentive fee works, whether it's cost plus or fixed price. Award does not. So we're starting to put that data out there to really, and then of course each conclusion and statistically then draws your next set of questions. But that's what we need to do. So again, some of the statistical analysis that's just being done is the most basic stuff you would assume it was being done. Like I said, when I was 22 years old, we were doing that statistical analysis on Trident flight tests. I just assumed that the people 5 levels up looking at all the programs were doing the same kind of thing across acquisition. They weren't, or they aren't today, I should say that. I don't know what they were doing then. So that's all part of the transparency. The third, I'm gonna have to accelerate here because I want to leave time for questions. The third priority is what we're calling owning the technical baseline. And this is to reinforce the concept that in the government program office or the program office team, so it doesn't have to be the government employees only, it could be with an FFRDC, it could be with, you know, expert contractors or A&S, but that the government program office has the competencies to run its own models. If it's a technical system, it has access to its own models. If the contractor's models are proprietary, that's fine. Well, then hire a FFRDC or somebody else and develop their own system model. Sounds crazy. It's the world I grew up in, that's what we did. It's not because it's, you know, the government had its own models. The government, if the system is replacing the performance, or a system is replacing a system that is currently out there, the 3-dealer is a AOC, air defense radar, replacing a legacy radar. The program office should know the performance of the legacy system. How is it performing in the field today? What's its A sub O? What's its reliability? Now you say, what does that mean? That's not acquisition. Well, sure it is, because if you're being asked to work on the next version of it, and the requirement comes in that it needs to have a reliability. I use this on missiles all the time. I need a cruise missile with a reliability of 0.93. If the program office knows that the one it's replacing has a reliability of 0.67 and has had that for 20 years and everybody's happy with it, and you don't know how to get a reliability of 0.92, then you're a better program office. And you push back and you do better. So that's all part of owning the technical baseline. I'm not so naive, we're not so naive to think we can do it for all our program offices, but in our important ones, we want to do that. Own the master schedule, the software schedule. Data rights, not all data rights, not blindly ask for data rights, not to hurt industry unnecessarily, but particularly for sustainment, when we begin the program, have we thought through how we're going to sustain the program 20 years later, and can we compete the data right? Can we compete sustainment, which means we might have to have data rights. Those decisions are baked in at the very beginning of programs. And it requires a lot of work. It requires negotiation back and forth between industry and the government. It requires engineers and it requires lawyers. But it can be mutually beneficial to do that work. I often say to people, if they say, well, what are you saying? Are you saying that owning the technical baseline means that we're trying to push back on industry? No, not at all. My view, and I've never worked in pure industry at Johns Hopkins, APL, and MITRE, but I was always on that fuzzy area, each side. But I think this is what I'm going to say is true to all of you. It's always better to work for a strong program office. Very frustrating to work for a weak program office. I mean, even if you're getting paid a lot, it's very frustrating, right? I mean, it's in a couple of reasons. One is you'll get micromanaged probably, or you'll be ignored when you shouldn't be. Second is your program will probably not survive because it's got a weak program office. So this is all I'm talking about here. So that's the next one. The last one here that I want to talk about, I think that's the last one, is thinking about building the systems for the resiliency in the systems to deal with the future we're going to have. We all know that the future is going to be a pure competitor. We have it somewhere, we have it today. That is to build in the resiliency, obviously cyber, assume that space is going to be contested, assume that the adversary is watching everything we're doing, and be ready to build your systems for that. Don't assume the adversary is not as smart as we are, both in engineering and as well as tactics. So that sounds like an obvious thing, but it's one of those things when you're in the government having 13 meetings a day, sometimes slips by you. So those are the 5 areas. Hopefully I've talked about industry's role in each of them. I tried to weave that in. There's much more we can do with industry, and we should. And I'm looking forward to hearing your questions. But I think at that point, I stop my remarks, and then we can do the next phase. So, okay? Okay.
So if you,
Right over here?
yeah, have a glass of water if you'd like.
Sure.
Thank you very much, Bill. That is terrific. And I'm gonna start because I think this same question is in many other people's minds. Maybe I'm just a bad note taker, but I want to give you the opportunity to give us the 5th of your 5 initiatives.
Better buying power. How could I miss that?
Thank you. Okay. Okay.
How could I miss that? Frank Kendall. So we're the better buying power. The parts that the Air Force is doing all of the better buying power. We focusing on the ones that are showing the most bang for the buck for us. And they are, I'll rattle them off. The first is should cost. We're doing should cost across our programs. We started with the ACAT-1s. We have about 35 ACAT-1s, maybe about 60 ACAT-2s, and over 100 ACAT-3s, a couple hundred ACAT-3s. We're slowly but surely doing should cost all the way down that tier. And we're seeing real savings from that. And let me say a few more words about should cost, and then I'll talk about it.
We've got time.
Okay.
We've got time.
So should cost, what it is fundamentally taking the time on the government with industry to understand your costs and to take the time to see what's achievable and not make the assumption that what was true 3 years ago or 5 years ago is true today, and that you can't together wring more costs out. This is not, it is not an attack on profits. It's none of that. But what it is doing market research and doing the understanding, particularly in the supply chain. We've had cases where we have done it with the prime together, where when we ended it, us and the prime knew more about the supply chain costs at the end of it than neither of us knew at the beginning. So it's to really understand your costs and take the time to figure out ways around it. What should cost is not is, I always use this joke. Somebody got off an airplane 2 years ago and read an article on cloud computing, and then comes in and says, well, I just cut the IT budget by 30%. Why'd you do that? Cloud computing. That's not should cost. In other words, you just don't make up an idea and take part of their budget and say, whatever. So you have to actually, it's understanding your cost. And it's not taking the money first. Actually, what's in the system and what is official is the will cost, which is the independent cost estimate. When we find should cost savings, they have to be validated. But here's the key part. The money, the savings, first bid, if you will, on the money savings goes back to that program and portfolio. Doesn't mean that we at the top can't overrule them, but we try to avoid that if we can, because the idea is we don't want, no good deed goes unpunished. Right. It's the incentives. So that should cost. Affordability, another piece of Frank Kendall's and Ash Carter's Better Buying Power. Affordability is about not starting the program until you know what you can afford. It means looking at your portfolio beyond just 5 years, but the next 10 or 15 years. And saying, this is how much we can pay. So we're doing that right now for Minuteman follow-on. And that's a hard one. We're looking at, the same time we're doing the affordability analysis of a sand chart of the budget, we're doing the analysis of alternatives over here. And we're going to see which of these potentially can fit in here. So those are two examples. The third one I'd like to talk about, which I think is probably the one that's the most exciting, although like all of these things, it doesn't sound that way. But it's tying acquisition requirements closer together. We do it at the beginning of the program through the JROC process, and then we have something called configuration steering boards that are done annually. That's not enough. What we got to do is we have to have that dialogue back and forth between the warfighter experts and the acquisition team constantly as you're building the program. So we're starting these pilots, and more than pilots, called cost capability analyses, where we're working. We just did one, a great one with F-15 defensive systems, where we went back and forth with the experts at ACC on what they were willing to pay for in defensive systems and how much were they willing to pay and giving them more capability. And it was like a dialogue that was happening weekly where after 6 months, the warfighter realized what they really cared about was something different than they thought. And we realized on the acquisition side what we could do was pretty basic to achieve it. And make sure we do that at the beginning. So we have lots of really good ideas on bringing acquisition and requirements together. It's been said many times, just because we say it's a requirement shouldn't be the end of the conversation. It may not be the beginning, but it can be the beginning. If that's a requirement, let's talk about that. So those are 3 examples from Better Buying Power, but there's many more. So thank you for asking me to talk about that.
Yeah, good. All right, I do have a couple of other questions before I take questions from the audience. Rest assured, we've got about a half hour here. There should be plenty of time to air some things out. A big constituency of the Atlantic Council, as you might know, is the international community, and particularly a number of countries that are international partners of F-35. And so I would fail them if I didn't ask you to append to your comments about the F-35 the international partnerships, but in particular the following. What is the process by which perturbation, for good or ill, in the program flows down to your international partners? You'd be surprised at the number of phone calls we get from embassies that say, I just read this thing about the F-35, what are we going to do? And I think, I'll bet you there's a process by which that gets promulgated.
So there is. The F-35 program is just fascinating to watch. So I'll try to talk about a couple process things, but then answer just. So there's all these governance boards that exist, hierarchical in the F-35 program that involve the international partners. And the senior one is called the JESB, Joint Executive Steering Board. And that, right now, it's got all the senior partners on it, and it's literally a voting body. And all of these kinds of issues, governance issues, are staffed up and they vote through that body. And so it's a very formal process instead of bylaws. What has been, and just to address one of your examples, what has been a constant issue with the partners is communications. A GAO report comes out, exactly. a DOT&E report comes out, or I know you'd be shocked, but a press report comes out, and it may, we here in Washington say, oh, that's old news. They're just repeating what we know about 3F software. It's 5 months behind. They're just writing the same story with a different headline. it may be bouncing around the parliament of another country and causing,
Exactly.
So the JPO, the Joint Program Office for F-35, they have made it a priority that we're never going to not have some surprises with the partners, but to minimize that whenever they can. And one of the things we asked them just 2 days ago, we went around the table, was how is the communication? Are you getting surprised? And all of them said it is much, much better than it has been. We thank you. So what will happen is when there's an annual report coming out on anything, even when it's in its draft form, if we can get a release, quietly released to the partners so that they know it's coming and they're aware of it. The F-35 program has done a really good job with transparency, I think. Chris Bogdan does a nice job with that. But that's a challenge. The other challenge, which you alluded to, is perturbations. You call it perturbations. Country X or country Y or service X or service Y, Air Force, Navy, is moving airplanes around in the budget. Of course, that affects everybody. Some movement affects more than others. I think that what we tell people is there's always going to be changes around the margins. There's always going to be a 1 or 2% fluctuation based upon who's moved an airplane up or down. What, though, we have to know is when there's a collective decision point coming. An example might be the last year when we were building the POMs in DOD, and there were some scenarios that, the sequester scenario, we wanted to collectively know, okay, if the Air Force is looking at option A and the Navy's looking at option B and the Marines are looking at this, let's put it together and see what would be the excursions and the pricing effects of doing all that. And so we did that at the very beginning. It was actually Sean Stackley started it, and I worked with Sean on that, so that decision makers knew that, it's the F-35. You may think you're making a local decision, but it can ripple through to everybody else. For the partners, that's harder to do, of course. And I think that what we've been talking about, and this is just talk, and I don't want to get in front of Frank Kendall because Frank's just introduced this publicly yesterday, but we may be at a point in the next few years where we could start thinking about multi-year for F-35. Now, why would that be important? Well, if we could do it, at least in this country, and can you even imagine doing it with in the international? It obviously you can get better. It helps you with pricing, right? Because you can with F-30 with multi-years you can do things with the supply chain to get better prices. But it also gives some incentive for stability, additional incentive for stability. The deal with a multi-year is that you agree to buy a certain quantity to get this price. So if you change your quantity, then you don't get the price. It's kind of a nice little incentive that works both ways. Mm-hmm. If we could get that into the F-35 program, we might add some more stability to the quantities. So those are two examples that I wanted to mention.
Okay, good. I also wanted to ask, basically bring a question over from this other series that I alluded to, our Captains of Industry series, mm-hmm. where CEOs come and talk about these things. And one of the recurring themes of that series has been the significance of commercial technology for defense companies and for solutions to defense requirements, et cetera. But I have to say that I actually hear not divergent, but different points of view about just how important commercial technologies really are, which is to say in public, I think people are happy to say, yes, commercial technologies are important, but I also have been in some private audiences with folks from industry that say, we got that. We do that. We do as much of that as there is to be done. I'd like to know, from your perspective as a public official in the Air Force, are commercial technologies important? Do you rely on what we would regard as the defense industry to access commercial technologies for you, or is it being overplayed a little?
Oh, I think it's very important. I think sometimes it's, I don't know, overplayed, but it's sometimes there's a little bit of misunderstanding, maybe not within the industry, but outside. The idea that you can do some of these things completely commercial, has allowed us to do had some pretty difficult acquisition experiences. I tell people, just because of my background, and don't tell me that for follow-on J-stars, it's as easy as just buying a commercial plane and slapping a radar on it and we'll be done. Mm-hmm. That may be what you think. I've heard, but I've got other experiences that says it's not that easy. So sometimes we sell ourselves on things, convince ourselves that something is easier than it is based upon something we see commercially, and you have to be very careful about that. I think there's a lot. This is opinion. I don't have data on this, but I think 10 years ago there was a lot of excitement I think, justified about net centricity. About as we all have data standards and we go to service-oriented architectures and enterprise services, we're going to revolutionize acquisition and warfighting. I think part of it was based upon this feeling that we saw what was happening in the commercial world, and we saw what was happening, our own experience in using data and accessing data and the internet, and how it was revolutionizing our workplaces, which it was, and we thought naturally that would scale to weapon systems. Without, of course, it's not been easy, has it? Well, now we've learned a lot of lessons. One is, what's the equivalent of a service level agreement in the DoD? I always used to say with my friends at APL on Tomahawk, am I going to rely on a service to launch Tomahawk that I don't even know the person, I don't know that they're going to deliver it? Am I going to rely on that? It's a changing culture. Also, for IT and commercial IT, to take advantage of advances, you have to have a marketplace that's demanding the next version of something. There has to be a value to being first to market. What does it mean to be first to market in the DoD? We haven't figured that one out. So there's places where the commercial has not translated as easily. But then also where we've made misjudgments, where we have thought that taking a green airplane, a commercial airplane, and outfitting it with a capability was easier than it is. Particularly when we're talking command and control and sensors, it's not easy at all. It's very complicated, and a simple change to where you need to put a sensor could require a structural change to the airplane. And a couple of those, and this commercial jet you thought you had is not really the commercial jet anymore. And so I think that's where it's been oversold. Where I think we still have work to do better, and this is the part that I don't know that we can't do better, is I go from my own experience. And again, we were in organizations I worked in, we were not always good at exploiting the best parts of our organization for our current customers. My customer's happy with me. I've got this line of business. My colleague over there has got this other customer in another community, maybe a civilian community. They're happy. We'll go to meetings together. We'll maybe do some cross-organizational IRADs, and everybody's happy. Am I really using their technology and their engineers to solve my customer's problem? No, I'm not. Right. If I did, they'd be mad. What are you taking my engineers for? So are we really? I'm not saying that that there aren't exceptions to what I'm saying. I'm saying, are we really exploiting the commercial side of our companies and bringing it onto our military side? Are we really doing it? And I'm talking about at the engineer level. I'm talking about the innovation level. I don't know. I can't tell. I just know from my experience that it's actually much harder to do than it should be. Again, for the reasons I said. You can take something that's working really well over here, a customer is really happy, and we're going to just make your customer unhappy because we want to try to do that thing for the Air Force. Well, okay.
But I'm also hearing you imply that that's no fool's errand. Your experience or instinct is there's value in actually doing that, not just going to meetings.
So I think there's absolute value, and I think it's harder than it seems, and I think we shouldn't be naive about how hard it is. So when I go, and I've been on both sides of this, when you had VIPs visit me, my organizations, they would say that to us. Well, why aren't you using what you're doing over here? And now when I'm in this job, you'll go and you'll get this briefing on this really incredible technology in the commercial side. And then you get the military briefing in the afternoon, and you say, well, what about the thing I saw this morning? Yeah, we know about that. We're working it. Okay, but what are you going to do with that? Yeah. Well,
we had a meeting.
We're going to do some IRAD on it. Maybe they'll do some IRAD. I was like, okay, but 6 months from now, are you going to be able to show me how you think you're going to get that into your military thing? You have to actually proactively push it like that to see that. So.
Okay, thank you. All right, excuse me. We will take questions. There's a woman in a red blouse right here on the aisle. We have a microphone. If you'll just wait a second, my mic runners will run so we don't occupy too much time. Thank you. Please.
Thank you, Steve. Amy Butler with Aviation Week, Mr. Secretary. I'm curious, you've talked a lot about transparency, about doing the 80% solution, staying on target, not getting a little overly ambitious with goals. At the same time, the Air Force is on the cusp of a period of time when you're going to be buying F-35s, LRSBs, once you get that on contract, the tanker. You're now talking about Minuteman replacement and adding on a Joint STARS replacement. Even without sequestration, it seems like that's going to be maybe a snake eating an elephant? You know, how are you going to
Right.
digest all of those priorities in your budget?
Right. So I think there's kind of answer your questions. You're talking about really two things that are related but actually separate. The first thing is within an individual program being disciplined to not go for beyond what you actually need. This is the 80% solution. I used LRSB as an example. KC46 has also been very disciplined in its requirements. So within the program doing it, okay, but then what you're asking you're asking the bigger picture where, well, so what if you do it great in the programs? If you have N+2 programs, you can only afford N. How you deal with that? That's where the affordability comes in. So when I said earlier, I talked about the better buying power, and I used Minuteman 3 as the example. Remember I said that right now we're doing the AOA for Minuteman 3 at the same time we're doing affordability analysis. That affordability analysis is the sliver, is the snake that says this is how big your snake is. This is how big your snake is, and you've got to fit into this part of the snake. Now, you know, that is only as good as your projections of the budget, but we put in worst case, best case, and intermediate cases. So I'll just speak for the Air Force, and this is I really give General Welsh credit for this. General Welsh is having the Air Force right now build, they call them sand charts, literally 10, 20-year plans of what a budget is going to be and what we can afford in each one of these categories. Because what happens, and everybody in Washington or DOD knows this, is you have what's called, in the Navy they call it bow wave, we call it a shock wave in the Air Force, in the Army they call it a berm, I think. But it's right at the, you balance the budget in the palm, which is at 5 years, and then you start to do this. And then, and there's a subtle trick to that where you get a new program, you get it a little bit in the 5th year of the palm, so you can say it's in the budget. Well, all that's doing is pushing the thing for the snake, right? So what affordability is mandating, and then additionally the leadership of people like General Welsh by doing the sand charts is we're not starting programs we can't afford. So that is forcing discussions right now of, oh gee, it's 2025. We have LRSB, we have Minuteman follow-on, we have KC, not just KC46A, KC46Y and Z. How is that all going to work together? And so people are doing that work right now, and they're having that discussions. The test, as far as I'm concerned, is whether the system will allow that to occur. Because, you know, people still want to get, and I don't mean just in the Defense Department. You know what I'm talking about. We saw how difficult it was in this budget. Will the system allow us to not do programs? Yeah.
Okay, I'll take a question, gentleman in the third row here.
Sir, again, thank you for coming over and spending time with us. I'm Major General Ted Mercer.
I remember you, Stratcom.
Yes, sir. Yes,
How
sir,
are you?
indeed. Those were the good old days.
DSB study.
Roger that.
Yeah.
Roger that. Those were the good days.
Yeah.
Sir, do you believe that at this point in time you have the regulatory guidance and the legal authority to allow you to acquire your systems and capability as efficiently as you would like?
Generally, yes, I do. I do think that, you know, it's not that occasionally we won't get something that's well-intentioned and you say, well, that's not going to help us. But generally, we do. I actually want to compliment, you know, I know that Representative Thornberry, I know that on the Senate side, staffer like Peter Levine, they're very knowledgeable, trying to help us. We're always in dialogue saying, will this help you, will this hurt you? So I'm actually pretty... That was a pleasant surprise for me. I came into this job expecting to have a lot of that weighing us down. Occasionally you'll get something, you'll get somebody putting something in that you say that's not helping us, but then we go over and we talk to them. But I know I'll again echo Frank Kendall. Frank will say, I'm paraphrasing Frank, so please forgive me, Frank. But you know, you don't hire a football coach and then say, okay, here are the 7 plays you must, I suppose you could do this. Some owners might do this. Here are the first 10 plays you have to run every game, and you always have to pass on 3rd down. You don't pass on 3rd down, you got to get my approval first. You know, you hire a football coach. So, you know, you can't legislate acquisition. You have to allow enough space and then get the best people. Mm-hmm. But I haven't found that to be, Rosa, I have not found that to be really as challenging as I thought I would find. So.
Okay. There's a question, gentleman in the striped shirt right there in the middle.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Pat Hose with Defense Daily.
Hi,
Secretary, can you give us an update on the light air support program for Afghanistan? I know you guys are supposed to deliver planes by September. Are you still on track for that? And can you give us a couple important milestones before then you're focused on?
For LAS, I'm afraid I'm going to have to get the detail. As far as I know, we're on track for that. It's the delivery, like you say, is in September. I'll have to get to you the details on any milestones between now and then. I can assure you this: the fact that I'm not answering your question tells me, knowing the system, that it's going well. Okay. And if
Your day is full of problems.
yes,
not
yes. Believe me. The fact that I am not like, well, gee, we're a week behind on this and that tells you it's probably going fine. But we can follow up with you and get that to you. And because there was a period where I was all over LAS. Believe me. Okay, thanks.
Gentleman toward the back, on the middle row here on the left, on my left. Right there. Thank you.
Thanks. Sir, Aaron Meadow with Defense News. You kind of casually mentioned that there's a program you expect to have a Nunn-McCurdy breach sometime this year because of sequestration. Can you say what program that is, and are you worried about other programs having the same issue?
Aaron, always looking for the story, right?
It's his job.
Yeah, no. I can't, I can't tell you what it is. And actually, I'm not even sure I know what it is. I just know that, and it's a long story, but the bottom line is as we're doing budget drills, what we say to leadership, okay, if we have to take this much money out of this part of the portfolio, here's what happens. You will break the multi-year if you do this. Phil, I'm just using an example. You will cause a Nunn-McCurdy on program Y this. The one that I was referring to is actually one that I don't think is going to happen. Okay, and it has to do with the fact that I think the numbers are going to be fine in that program. But then, you know the way this business is. Next week I could get a phone call saying we got a Nunn-McCurdy. So but no, I'm not going to tell you what it is, and I don't think even the one that I'm thinking of is going to happen. But put it this way, and this is something we got to educate everybody on. There's not a whole lot of places you can find money when you return to sequester. You only find it in the operations and sustainment accounts. That's why we hit readiness. And the other place you find is RDT&E and procurement. Well, what do you do in RDT and procurement when you try to find money? You protect the programs you try to protect, and then the rest are kind of like, your children that you're trying to just, protect, but you're not sure you can protect them. Well, what do people do? If it's munitions, you reduce the quantity of the munitions. Well, then you've got to watch at your minimal sustainable rate. If it's platforms, you reduce the quantity of the airplanes, of the platforms. You spread it out to the right. Then you say to yourself, well, gee, if I spread it out to the right, does the cost per platform go up such that I trigger a Nunn-McCurdy? So those are the discussions that are happening all the time in this current budget environment. So is that an acquisition issue? Yeah, but it's really what's underneath it is the budget. So I think Aaron, that's the message I'm trying to convey to people behind that. So.
Since the reporters among us did not get to this question, I want to get it in before we end, and it is this. Does the Air Force think we need a new first stage, a boost stage rocket engine to succeed the RD-180?
Not familiar with the issue. I'm kidding.
I thought sure I wouldn't have to be the one to ask that question, but I feel compelled.
It's not like LAS, right? So you guys all know the issue, which is the Russian engines, the RD-180s that are used on the Atlas V in the ULA program. Long story short is this is not first thing, this is I'm learning all this over the last 8 months, and I'm not in the space mafia yet. They wouldn't accept me as a member, but I know enough to know.
Got to learn the handshake.
To know how they argue with each other. That this is, of course, not a new thing. This has been around for a long time, and most recently, I want to say back in February or March, Secretary Hagel asked the Air Force to look into it one more time, just as the troubles were starting to happen in the Ukraine. And so we did that. I actually, Secretary James and Frank Kendall asked me to get a study on it. So I commissioned a study, a quick turnaround study. Some of you may have heard of it. It's been in the press, led by retired General Mitch Mitchell and co-chaired by Mike Griffin, former administrator of NASA. And they did a great job. They in about 5-6 weeks, they looked at everything in industry. They interviewed everybody, and they came back and basically gave me and gave the leadership of the department and also administration some recommendations. Their recommendations had two parts to them. One were some near-term things we need to do, which we're doing. We're basically doing the near-term recommendations. So I've recommended, and it's been accepted, that we move out of near-term recommendations. Relook at the manifest that we have now and see if we can prioritize and move missions around, assuming that the 16 RD-180s or 15 are all we have. And then the second, start doing some integration studies and movement to take what we were planning, payloads we're planning to launch on Atlas and move to Delta and see what we can do to mitigate that. That's happening right now. It's actually almost done. So there's a series of those kind of things. But then the longer term recommendation was the Mitchell panel actually recommended consideration of a new domestic engine. But they also said, you know, that so what we've taken away from this, and the decision has not been made, what we've taken away from this is that the Air Force, along with our partners in OSD and in the administration and across the space enterprise, including NASA, have to take another serious look at the future of domestic engines. And does it include a new engine? And in that trade space could be a new engine, but it's not saying we're going to do it. I don't think we know enough yet. But it's not taken off the table. There's a lot of strong views on that. I think that there's some interesting things we could play there in this space. One, and it's been talked about, was and the Mitchell Commission actually recommended some type of public-private partnership. And because there's some very interesting concepts out there. The Mitchell Commission recommended a LOX hydrocarbon as being what they thought. But in fact, what we believe is that that's not necessarily even, I wouldn't even box it in at that. I think there's enough interesting concepts out there. So I think it's in the mix, but it's not a done deal that it's going to happen or not happen. Because it's a you know, to go ahead and do it is a very expensive proposition, as everybody has mentioned.
The snake and the elephant problem again. We have time for 2 more questions, if they're not long in duration. The gentleman with the striped tie, 2 seats in, yep.
Thank you. Matt Karras from Avocent. We've heard a lot from the Air Force leadership over the last couple of years about differing priorities beneath the holy trinity of whether it's CRH, JSTARS, now AWACS decision in 19 Minuteman. The one we haven't heard is FX, which has sort of appeared in the budget in AOA and the rest. And I was just wondering sort of where you see that fitting in Air Force priorities and sort of what you see. What's the state of communications with industry on that, and whether you see a kind of a role for industry to take the lead in shaping that, or if it's even just so far off that it's not even part of your priority list right now?
Well, you know, it's interesting because FX actually, or whatever you want to call it, next generation, you know, not even a platform, but what is it? It's probably family of systems. What's the next generation of air warfare? Is actually a very high priority, as the chief has said, and Frank Kendall has said. In fact, there's a initiative that AT&L, OSD with Air Force and Navy is doing with DARPA called the Air Dominance Initiative. It's exactly to get at this question. So from a dollars perspective or an acquisition perspective, it's not an issue because it's small dollars. But the importance of it and its S&T and its future concept work is very, very critical right now. So the reason I didn't put it in my top 3, or if I went with some other ones, is that it's not an acquisition program. But it's an intellectual and S&T issue that it may be our highest priority in the Air Force, if you think about our long term, is what is the future of air dominance? And so I'll tell you what I and others want to do is we want to take the concepts, and this is where industry can be part of it, and see how we can, over the next few years, and I'd be the first to tell you I don't have this all mapped out, or we don't have mapped out. How can we start teaming with industry on experimentation and concepts related to next generation air dominance? Not talk about what platform it is or what the mold line is or anything, not get into that stuff, but really talk about what are the concepts that we should be considering for next generation air dominance. And I like to think of it as family of systems. So it's not, you don't just think about, you know, what's the airplane, if it's an airplane. It's what are we trying to accomplish, what are the effects, and what are the pieces that we need. And then out of that, look at the technologies and the concepts that are pretty cool. And we all have our favorite list. You know, they all, you know, directed energy, high-powered microwave, you know, hypersonics. I got my own list and but it's that stuff. How does it play in next generation air dominance, autonomy? So.
Last question is all the way in the back on the middle row.
Thanks, Greg Clary from CNN. Wondering, given the deteriorating situation in Iraq and the potential for administration to order airstrikes, how well do you think the Air Force is positioned in that region to carry out those airstrikes if they are ordered?
Well, I'm not, first of all, I could tell you an answer, but I wouldn't be authoritative because I'm the acquisition executive, I'm not the operational. My assumption, but I would defer you to the Air Force and to OSD, is that the combatant commander and USAFE and CENTCOM and CENTAF are, I'm sure, working very hard on that all right now, and I don't think there'd be any reason to think that they're not going to be ready to do whatever they have to do. I mean, I think that, you know, that's the thing about the Air Force and other services, but the Air Force is, you know, at any day, the balloon may go up and you have to do something globally, and who would, I don't know, I wouldn't, I mean, maybe people all predicted this a month ago that this would be happening in Iraq, but just think about that. This stuff can happen very quickly. So that's the issue, actually, to tie it back to the budget. That's why readiness and going after operations to sustainment is so critical. Because when we were doing the sequester, that's the part of the budget gets hit. Well, guess what that is? That's number of ready airplanes that can go and do that kind of job. So, but I would assume that when called upon, they'll do as they always do. They'll do great.
Well, I think it must be said that you have more than adequately fulfilled the expectation, the very high expectations that Arnold set for being able to hear from a senior executive in government who is technically savvy, full of common sense, and I think you also can give yourself high marks on the transparency priority. And I want to thank you very much for that, and I want to thank all of you for coming.